President Trump meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the White House, and it could get a little testy today. Remember this exchange last time Carney was in the Oval Office.
An apparent love-in between leaders as Canada's Prime Minister is welcomed to the White House for high-level talks on trade and tariffs. Now, this was Mark Carney's second trip to the inner sanctum at the invitation of the U.S. President, and comes at a time when Donald Trump is threatening new tariffs.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale, ever.
Never say never. Never say never.
The story breaking out of Washington tonight has left even seasoned analysts stunned. Multiple White House sources confirm that the administration is preparing to formally roll back tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, a move President Trump once vowed would never happen under his watch. And what triggered this sudden reversal wasn't congressional pressure, nor domestic backlash. It was Mark Carney's quiet, calculated diplomacy that turned the tide. For months, Trump's team has portrayed the tariff standoff as a symbol of American strength. They framed it as an economic battle America was destined to win, a test of endurance against its northern neighbor. But as of tonight, that narrative is collapsing. Because behind closed doors, even Trump's own advisors now admit the tariffs backfired, damaging American manufacturing, straining key industries, and giving Canada leverage Washington never expected it would have. And that brings us to tomorrow, when Prime Minister Mark Carney will walk into the Oval Office not as a man pleading for relief, but as a leader standing on equal ground. The headlines may read, "Talks resume," but make no mistake, the balance of power has shifted. This is Traveling Vibes, bringing you the story behind the story. If you care about what's really shaping US-Canada relations and how these decisions ripple through jobs, trade, and global influence, make sure you subscribe right now. Because what happens in the next 24 hours could redefine America's trade policy for the next decade. Let's unpack how we got here. When President Trump reinstated tariffs on Canadian metals earlier this year, the decision was pitched as a defense of American workers. Trump's speech at a rally in Michigan repeated the same line. "We're bringing back our steel. We're bringing back our jobs." But behind the applause and patriotic slogans, numbers told a different story. U.S. steel mills didn't reopen at the promised rate. Prices on raw materials rose sharply, hurting auto manufacturers in Michigan, construction firms in Texas, and even small hardware businesses across the Midwest. Within 3 months, over 11,000 American jobs tied to industries dependent on Canadian imports were either suspended or lost. Companies that relied on cross-border aluminum faced supply shortages, and U.S. exports to Canada fell by more than $2.3 billion. The tariffs that were supposed to strengthen America's hand ended up hurting its own economy first. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Mark Carney's response was nothing short of methodical. Unlike the loud retaliations of past trade disputes, Carney's approach was rooted in silence and strategy. He didn't escalate on Twitter or trade threats through the media. Instead, he built alliances quietly, meeting with European, Asian, and Latin American leaders to widen Canada's trade options. Within weeks, Canada finalized trade expansions with Japan and the European Union, ensuring that if the U.S. market tightened, Canadian exports would still have a home. Then, Carney turned to domestic reinforcement, investing in Canadian industries most vulnerable to the tariffs. Steel towns in Ontario received fresh government contracts, and new funding flowed into modernized production facilities. The message was subtle but powerful. Canada would not beg. It would adapt. As U.S. manufacturers began to feel the pressure, calls started pouring into Washington from lobbyists and state governors. Michigan's Auto Alliance issued a blunt warning. The tariffs were costing U.S. factories millions per week. Senators from both parties demanded a review. And while Trump doubled down publicly, his aides were quietly exploring a path to exit without admitting defeat. That path, as it turns out, runs straight through tomorrow's Oval Office meeting. Behind the scenes, Canadian negotiators have held a series of intense private talks with U.S. trade officials since late September. Their message was clear. The tariffs were no longer sustainable for either side. But the key shift came 2 weeks ago when data from the U.S. Department of Commerce showed that the tariffs had increased American production costs by nearly 14% while failing to bring back domestic steel jobs. That report, never meant for public release, was leaked to Bloomberg and Reuters, and it changed everything. It forced the White House to acknowledge what industry insiders had been saying for months. The tariffs were politically popular but economically disastrous. Carney's move was simple. He didn't demand Trump's apology or concessions. He offered a deal grounded in pragmatism. Canada would guarantee a stable export volume and stricter quality checks on steel. And in return, Washington would phase out tariffs gradually over a 90-day window. It was the kind of compromise Trump's team could spin as a victory, while Canada would get exactly what it wanted: the tariffs gone. Yet what makes this story truly remarkable is not the policy itself, but the contrast in leadership styles it revealed. Trump's approach has always been about domination, loud, public, and theatrical. Carney's is the opposite: quiet, patient, surgical. And in this case, the quiet strategy won. Let's look deeper at why this moment matters beyond the headlines. For decades, the US-Canada trade relationship has been one of the most stable on Earth. Over $1.2 trillion in goods and services exchanged annually. But tariffs on steel and aluminum fractured that trust. When Trump imposed them under the banner of national security, even America's allies were caught off guard. To many, it was less about economics and more about control. A test to see who would bend first. But Canada didn't bend. It innovated. Carney's economic doctrine, one he often describes as resilience through diversification, meant Canada would never again be held hostage by a single market, even if that market was the United States. In less than a year, Canada doubled exports to South Korea, signed a strategic metals deal with Germany, and invested heavily in domestic renewable infrastructure that reduced its dependency on US materials altogether. By the time Trump realized the tariffs weren't forcing concessions, Canada had already moved on. That's the real power of this story. The White House is reacting, not leading. And while US media may frame the tariff rollback as a strategic adjustment, make no mistake, this is a policy retreat born from necessity, not generosity. Trump isn't lifting tariffs because he wants to mend fences. He's lifting them because the math left him no choice. The political optics, however, are another matter. Trump will likely present tomorrow's announcement as a deal of fairness, claiming victory for American jobs. Expect phrases like America first, but fair trade always. Yet the underlying data shows a simple truth. American industry needed relief, and it came not from pressure, but from Canada's consistency. Let's pause here for a moment. If you're enjoying this deep analysis and you want to stay ahead of every major policy shift impacting the US economy, make sure you hit subscribe. Traveling Vibes brings you daily stories that connect politics, economics, and global influence, all in one place. Now, let's move to what's happening behind closed doors tonight. Sources close to the US Chamber of Commerce say that several large industrial donors, particularly those tied to steel manufacturing in Pennsylvania and automotive supply chains in Michigan, have privately warned Trump that continuing the tariffs could cost the Republican Party millions in campaign funding next year. These are not just business leaders, they're political heavyweights with real influence. And they've made it clear, if the administration doesn't resolve this dispute with Canada, they'll divert their support elsewhere. That's the kind of pressure no president can ignore, no matter how confident the public image. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, the atmosphere is calm but focused. Carney's advisors have already outlined the talking points for tomorrow's meeting: a roadmap for tariff removal, an emphasis on North American energy integration, and a call for new cooperation on critical minerals. What's fascinating is that Carney is not treating this as a reconciliation meeting. It's being framed as an alignment session, a term that signals equality, not submission. And that's exactly the message Ottawa wants Washington to hear. Because the last 6 months have proven a hard truth for US strategists. The era of unilateral dominance is over. Canada, long seen as the junior partner in North American trade, has demonstrated that economic resilience and diversification can outmaneuver even the most powerful rhetoric. Let's talk about that quiet strength for a moment. Carney's entire strategy revolved around 3 principles: discipline, diversification, and diplomacy. He understood that responding emotionally to Trump's provocations would only fuel the chaos. So instead, he focused inward, building a more self-reliant Canadian economy, forming partnerships globally, and letting results speak louder than rhetoric. And now, the proof is in the data. Canada's GDP growth has outpaced the US for 3 consecutive quarters. Its Export Diversification Index, the measure of how widely spread a country's trading partners are, has reached an all-time high. And while the US manufacturing sector contracted by nearly 1.2% this year, Canada's remained stable. That stability is why tomorrow's meeting isn't just another bilateral talk. It's a moment of quiet reckoning. Because for Trump, lifting the tariffs means admitting that his signature trade weapon has limits. For Carney, it means validating a strategy that many doubted would ever work. And there's something deeply symbolic about that. 2 leaders, 2 styles, one governed by noise, the other by patience. And in the end, it's the patient one who forces the change. As analysts across the US note tonight, the political implications of this shift are massive. Economically, removing tariffs will ease pressure on US manufacturers, lower costs for American consumers, and likely stabilize North American supply chains heading into 2026. But politically, it signals that the White House is not as unyielding as it once appeared. That's the part many of Trump's supporters may struggle to process. Because this moment exposes a paradox. Trump's America First strategy only works when America's partners cooperate. And if those partners refuse to play by his rules, his leverage disappears. So when Carney walks into the Oval Office tomorrow, he won't just be negotiating trade. He'll be redefining what partnership means in an age of political nationalism. And that person isn't in Washington tonight. He's in Ottawa, preparing for a meeting that will mark the moment Canada stopped reacting to American policy and started shaping it. If you found this story as revealing as we did, don't forget to hit subscribe and join the Traveling Vibes community. We're tracking every move that reshapes North American power, and tomorrow's headline might just prove that quiet leadership still wins in the age of noise.